Ancestral Puebloans, the civilization from which present-day Pueblo tribes descended, emerged as early as 1500 BC in an area of what is now the southwestern U.S. and dispersed suddenly in the 1200s. So they existed in what was basically minus 1500 all the way out to plus 1200 AD or CE, Common Era, abandoning established villages with systems for farming crops and turkeys. So they abandoned their farming, they abandoned their, think they abandoned their turkeys. I don't know, they left. Recent analysis comparing turkey remains at Mesa Verde. Okay, they don't tell us what Mesa Verde is, but I think we can assume Mesa Verde is where the Pueblo was. One such village in southern Colorado, two samples, so Mesa Verde is in Colorado, and I guess that's where the Pueblo Indians lived. Two samples from modern turkey populations in Rio Grande Valley of New Mexico. So New Mexico's another area. And they compared the turkeys from Mesa Verde. So I've got the Mesa Verde turkeys, and they're being compared to the New Mexico turkeys. And they determined that the latter birds descended in part from turkeys cultivated at Mesa Verde, with shared genetic markers appearing only after 1280. So New Mexico was 1280 plus for the birds. So these birds somehow from before 1200 appeared first in New Mexico at plus 1280 and afterward. So what can we conclude from that? Well, the people, when they left Mesa Verde, they must have migrated to Rio Grande, the New Mexico area, and brought their turkeys with them, because the first turkeys that matched the Mesa Verde turkeys appeared in New Mexico at 1280. So that's the conclusion. They must have migrated and brought their turkeys there. That's the most likely scenario. A, conditions of the terrains in the Rio Grande Valley and Mesa Verde had greater similarities in the past than they do today. That is completely irrelevant. The idea here is nothing about conditions of terrains or their similarity. B, some ancestral Puebloans migrated to the Rio Grande Valley in the late 1200s, we think so, and carried farming practices with them, including their turkeys. That definitely seems to be the case. I think B is going to be our answer. C, indigenous peoples living in the Rio Grande Valley primarily planted crops and did not cultivate turkeys. Okay, possibility that just nobody used turkeys before 1280? Not likely. That's not a reasonable conclusion, especially based on the text. D, the ancestral Puebloans of Mesa Verde likely adopted the farming practices of indigenous peoples living in other regions. Okay, they might have done that, but the turkeys went from Mesa Verde to New Mexico over time. The answer choice in D would suggest it went from New Mexico to Mesa Verde over time. That's kind of the opposite of the relationship that the data suggests from the problem. The correct answer is B. Tides can deposit large quantities of dead vegetation within a salt marsh, smothering healthy plants and leaving a salt pan, a depressed void of plants, and tends to trap standing water in the marsh's interior. Ecologists, blah, 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 and colleagues found that burrowing crabs living within these pans improved drainage, so the water trapped drains out, due to the crabs loosening the soil, leading the pans to shrink as marsh plants move back in. As salt marsh edges, so at the edges, so what do we have here? Let's try to draw this. I've got the inside, that's the pan, and we have the water, and then at the edges, crab-induced soil loosening can promote marsh loss by accelerating erosion, suggesting the burrowing action of crabs. So inside, the crabs are good. They're helping the water drain out. But on the outside, it looks like the crabs are bad. They're causing erosion of the actual marsh. So this suggests that the burrowing action of crabs can be good or bad. It just depends where they are. A, can be beneficial to marshes with small pans, but can be harmful to marshes with large pans. Okay, this gets the idea of good and bad, but it's not small pan versus large pan. That's not the right idea. A is incorrect. B, may promote increases in marsh plants. So not the pans here, but remember, when they flood in the middle, they lose the plants. So increases in plants if the crabs are in the middle, or decreases in marsh plants, which I guess is erosion, or erosion is an example of plants and soil moving away, depending on the crab's location. This looks good. Okay, it's focusing on the increase, decrease of plants, but I still think that's logically connected and good. Let's check C and D. C tends to be more heavily concentrated in areas of marsh interiors, the burrowing action of crabs, with standing water than at marsh edges. It does not compare the amount that's done inside versus outside. That's incorrect. D, varies in intensity depending on the size of the pan relative to the size of the surrounding marsh. No, we know nothing about the size of the pan to the size of the marsh. That is not in the evidence. The correct answer is B. Compiled in the late 1500s, largely through the efforts of indigenous scribes, Mexicanos is the most important collection of poetry in Nahuatl, the principal language of the Aztec Empire. The poems portray Aztec society before the occupation of the empire by the army of Spain. So we have poems that are Aztec poems of the Nahuatl, and they are before Spain. Okay? And marginal notes of Mexicanos indicate that much of the collection's content predates the initial invasion. Nonetheless, some of the poems contain inarguable references to beliefs and customs common in Spain during this era. So some of the poems actually refer to Spain. How could that be if they were predating the Spanish invasion and the occupation of the empire? We must conclude, well, they couldn't have written about Spain before Spain came. We have to conclude that the poetry continued after the invasion, and some of it included, mentioning or references to Spain, I would think. So the scholars have included that poetry post-dates Spain also and refers to it, because otherwise they didn't even know what they were to refer to. So A, while its content largely predates the invasion, Mexicanos also contains additions made after the invasion. Yeah, that's basically it. That's the idea. I think A is going to be the right answer. Let's check B, C, and D. Although those who compiled Mexicanos were fluent in Nahuatl, they had limited knowledge of the Spanish language. Well, yeah, but then why would they have references to Spain? That doesn't make any sense. It's technically not really relevant because it's not about the Spanish language. C, before the invasion by Spain, the poets of the Aztec Empire borrowed from the literary traditions of other societies. Yeah, except Spain, they didn't borrow the literary traditions from Spain because they predated Spain's arrival in the Americas. That seems like a possibility or plausibility, except that it's not, because they could not have borrowed from Spain as among a particular other society. D, the references to beliefs and customs in Spain should be attributed to a coincidental resemblance between the societies of Spain and the Aztec Empire. Okay, this is another answer we've seen in other different questions like this. It could have been chance that they were the same. Yeah, okay, that's possible, but that's not what's supported by the evidence. The correct answer is A. Gestures in painting are typically thought of as bold, expressive brushstrokes. In the 1970s, American painter Jack Whitten built a big tool he named the Developer to apply paint to an entire canvas in one motion. So you can imagine painters, they kind of take their brush and they apply it one by one all over the canvas. But this guy built a tool that was just a big brush, it seems like, and it just raked over the canvas at once, it sounds like. So signaling a clear departure from the prevalence of gestures in his work from the 1960s. Some art historians claim this shift represents removing gesture from the process. What did he do? He took different gestures, many of them, to one gesture. Therefore, regardless of whether using the developer constitutes, the developer is this big machine. We call it the developer, just so we know what they're talking about there, constitutes a gesture. So this is a gesture. It might be one gesture only, but it's a gesture. Both Witten and these art historians likely agree. So the historians thought it was removing gesture, but it just reduced gesture according to the premise of the last sentence. So what would they agree on? Well, they'd agree that old painters used more gestures. So if it's definitely gesture, they used more gestures before, and using the developer was not removing gesture, but reducing it, maybe to just smaller number, even one gesture only. So A, any tool that a painter uses to create an artwork is capable of creating gestures. Any tool? No, we have no idea. It's just this tool that creates one big gesture. B, Witten's work from the 60s exhibits many more gestures than his work from the 70s does. Yes, in the 60s, Witten painted this normal way. In the 70s, he built the developer. So it's likely this work had many more gestures. Okay, that's probably true. We just can't be 100% sure. Witten became less interested in exploring the role of gesture in his work. No, he actually was very interested in the role of gesture. That's why he made this machine to show one gesture could be very interesting in its own right. So that's not right. C. D. Witten's work from the 60s is much more realistic than the 70s. Who defines what realistic is, versus abstract versus, actual, photograph-like painting? No, that's just not the right idea. B is the correct answer. During the Bourbon Restoration in France, 1814 to 1830, the right to vote required in part that a person paid at least 300 francs in direct taxes. So in order to vote, you had to pay taxes. The four most common taxes were levied on real estate, both land and buildings, the door and windows, the rental values, homes, and the business. So real estate taxes were the most common taxes. And you had to pay taxes to vote. We know both those facts, which are independent as of this point. What else do we have? The rental value. Foreign investors are either exempt from taxation or highly taxed lightly. Although relatively few people paid the tax on real estate, so not many people paid this real estate tax. It was the main means of voter qualification and accounted. So everybody, now they are related. So everybody who registered to vote and paid those taxes also paid our real estate taxes. Well, real estate taxes over here. So if you registered to vote, you also paid the real estate taxes. But most people didn't pay real estate taxes according to the background material. So that means only a few people had to vote. So few people voted because only few people registered for real estate taxes. And those people represent 2/3 of government receipts during this period. So not only that, they must have paid a lot in the taxes because it's the big percentage of the overall revenue, suggesting that during the Bourbon Revolution, a few rich people voted and not much more than that, right? And they also owned valuable, I'll just put dollars, real estate. So a few rich people voted, and they're the people who owned a lot of real estate because they paid all the real estate taxes. So I think that's what we're looking for. Let's see. A, those people who had the right to vote most likely had substantial holdings of French real estate. I think that's correct. I think that's consistent with the idea. The voting habits of French artisans and merchants, the habits were effective in reducing tax burdens. No, it says nothing about taxes on businesses. except for that the businesses, especially foreign ones, paid little. No, that's not the idea here. C, the number of doors and windows in French residences was kept to a minimum but increased after that. No, that's not correct. That's not the idea here. French people with significant foreign investments were unlikely to have the right to vote. Well, French people with foreign investments. No, that says they're in another land. That means they're investing in England or the Americas or somewhere else. We know nothing about that and what taxes they paid, so we know nothing about their right to vote. That's just not applicable or even relevant to the text and the information given. A is the correct answer. Mosses can struggle in harsh desert conditions because these plants require enough sunlight for photosynthesis. Okay? But, contrasting that, not so much they risk dying out. Researchers found several species of this moss, a type of desert moss, growing under quartz crystals in the Mojave Desert. To evaluate whether these semi-transparent rocks benefited the moss, the researchers compared the shoot tissue, a measure of plant growth, of S. carnivorous when growing on the soil surface versus when the moss is growing under the quartz. So was it on the surface or growing under the moss? They compared its plant growth. They found that the shoot tissue was 62% longer for moss growing under the quartz as compared to the ones on the surface. So if they're on the surface, they were exposed to a lot of sunlight in the desert and they risked dying out. Whereas the ones under the rocks probably still had sunlight, just enough for photosynthesis, but not too much. So the rocks helped limit the risk to the moss. In other words, it helped moss grow, not die. So let's see if we can find that answer. A, S. carnivorous is one of the few types of moss that can survive under semi-transparent rocks. One of the few types of moss? Nothing says that other moss can't survive under the rocks. This is just the one that was tested. Don't think that's going to be the right answer. B, quartz crystals do not transmit the necessary sunlight for photosynthesis. No, I mean, maybe they don't transmit it. Quartz crystals don't necessarily transmit light at all, right? Do they allow enough light to pass through for photosynthesis? Well, clearly they do, because the moss underneath grew. This is not right in either case, however you read it. As carnivorous, growing under quartz crystals experience lower light intensity and thus are able to retain more moisture. Yes, they grow, they get lower intensity light, and they don't dry out, which is what happens when they're in the desert and they're exposed to too much light. So they retain moisture. That's the opposite of drying out. There and there. This is going to be our correct answer. D, quartz crystals are capable of supporting carnivorous growth if the crystals are not too thin. Well, who knows how thin or not thin they need to be? That's just simply not in the text. C is the correct answer. To better understand the burrowing habits of this particular shrimp, some students have used resin casting to obtain precise measurements of the shrimp's burrows. Okay, so I imagine the shrimp goes in and makes some kind of burrow, and then they pour in the casting, so then they can, sort of fill it up and then take the shape of it, right? And then measure the volume. Resin casting involves completely filling an empty burrow with a liquid plastic that hardens to create a three-dimensional model. However, okay, so that's what we're doing. However, recovering the model inevitably requires destroying the burrow. Sure, if I want to get this cast out, I'm going to break apart the sand or the soil or whatever it's in, right? In the 2022 study, colleagues discovered that an X-ray computed tomography, a CT scanner, can actually record a burrow's measurements, both at the moment in time and throughout the entire burrowing process. Okay, so basically they had something that could effectively video inside the burrow over time, right? Something that's impossible with resin casting, because why? Resin casting you can only do once. Once you do it, you then have to break everything apart. You can't do it over time. It just doesn't work that way. So A, it can only be used on burrows below a certain size. So nothing says anything about the size of the burrows we can use the casting. So it's impossible with resin casting because resin casting cannot repeat. You can do it once, so it cannot repeat over time. You can't do measurements over time. So B, it does not allow for multiple castings of the same burrow over time. Yep, that's it. That's kind of just what our guess is. B is going to be our right answer. The casting process takes more time than a belullus takes to construct a burrow. A belullus is the shrimp, I guess. So no, it's not that the casting takes longer than the shrimp does. D, the process of recovering the model distorts the resin shape. Recovering the model distorts the resin shape? No, when the resin gets pulled out, it distorts the burrow shape. That is what we're told. This is simply not in the passage. We're kind of mixing up the facts here. Okay, correct answer is B.